I knew the HOA was bad news the moment I moved in, but I didn't expect them to go this far. When I bought my property on the outskirts of town, I made sure my land wasn't under HOA jurisdiction. I had acres of open space, a beautiful barn for my horses, and peace of mind knowing no one could tell me what to do with my own land. That was until Helen Caldwell, the HOA president, decided she didn't like that. Helen was the worst kind of HOA tyrant, middle-aged, power-hungry, and obsessed with control. She had no legal authority over my property, but that didn't stop her from trying to enforce her ridiculous rules. First, she sent me letters demanding I remove the unsightly barn because it clashed with the aesthetic of the community. Ignored them. Then she started fining me fines I legally didn't have to pay. Ignored those too. But Helen wasn't the type to take no for an answer. One morning, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. My stomach dropped. Rushing outside, I saw a bulldozer ripping through my barn like it was nothing more than a pile of twigs. My horses had been safely grazing in the pasture, but the barn I had built with my own hands was being torn apart before my eyes. I sprinted toward the site, fists clenched, heart pounding. "What the hell is going on?" I shouted over the roar of the machinery. Helen stood there, arms crossed, with that smug look she always had when she thought she was winning. "Your barn was an eyesore," she said, as if that justified the destruction. "The HOA board voted, and we decided it had to go." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You don't even have jurisdiction over my land." She waved a piece of paper in my face. "We annexed it," she said, like she had just checkmated me in some twisted game. "It's part of the HOA now." I snatched the paper from her hand. It was a mess of legal jargon, but I caught the important part. She had gone to the city council and somehow convinced them to approve an annexation of my property without my consent. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Helen scoffed. "Oh, please. You can either comply with HOA regulations or move somewhere else." I didn't respond. I just turned around and walked back to my house. She thought she had won. She thought she had crushed me. She had no idea what was coming. I spent the rest of the day documenting everything. I took photos of the wreckage, recorded statements from my neighbors who had witnessed the destruction, and collected every single letter the HOA had ever sent me. Then, I called my lawyer, Greg. He was a no-nonsense type of guy, the kind who didn't take kindly to power-hungry HOA boards trampling on people's rights. As soon as I told him what happened, he told me exactly what I needed to hear. Helen and her little band of tyrants had just made a massive legal blunder. The problem with HOAs is that they often think they have more power than they actually do. Sure, they can enforce rules on properties that voluntarily join them, but unilaterally annexing land without the owner's consent, that was a whole different story. Greg got to work immediately, digging through property records, zoning laws, and city council approvals. It didn't take long for him to find the cracks in Helen's scheme. The city council had approved the annexation based on falsified documents that Helen had submitted claiming I had agreed to join the HOA. That was outright fraud. While Greg prepared the lawsuit, I had my own plans. Helen thought she could destroy my barn and walk away without consequences. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. I started by filing a police report for destruction of property. It didn't take much to convince the authorities that what the HOA had done was illegal. The officer who took my statement shook his head as he looked over the photos of the demolished barn. He assured me that this wasn't just a civil matter, it was criminal. Then I went to the city council. My property had been annexed under fraudulent pretenses, and I wasn't about to let that stand. Greg and I compiled every bit of evidence we had and presented it at the next council meeting. Helen was there, of course, sitting in her usual seat at the front, acting like she ran the place. But when the council members started questioning her about the signatures on the annexation documents, her confidence began to crack. She stammered, trying to explain away the obvious forgery, but the evidence was overwhelming. When the council voted to immediately reverse the annexation, I caught the look of pure panic on her face. But that was only the beginning. With the annexation overturned, my lawsuit against the HOA moved forward. Greg made sure we sued for everything: property destruction, emotional distress, legal fees, and punitive damages. The HOA's insurance company took one look at the case and knew they were in deep trouble. While the legal battle raged on, I had another idea. Helen had gone after my property because she wanted control. She wanted everything to fit her perfect little vision of the neighborhood. So, I decided to hit her where it hurt the most. The HOA owned a small vacant lot in the middle of the neighborhood land they had planned to use for a fancy community garden. It was their prized possession, the thing Helen bragged about at every meeting. And thanks to a little research, I discovered that the HOA was drowning in legal fees after my lawsuit. They needed money fast. So, when they put the lot up for sale to cover their mounting expenses, I swooped in and bought it through a third party. Helen had no idea I was the new owner until the zoning permits were filed. And what did I build? A massive, state-of-the-art stable. The moment construction began, Helen lost what little composure she had left. She stormed over, demanding to know who had bought the land. When she found out it was me, she nearly exploded. She tried everything to stop it: filing complaints, calling in inspectors, even trying to get the city to revoke my permits. But I had done everything by the book. There was nothing she could do. By the time the stable was completed, the HOA was in shambles. They had lost the lawsuit, been forced to pay out a hefty settlement, and now, right in the middle of their perfect little neighborhood, stood a structure that reminded Helen of her failure every single day. And the best part? I opened the stable to the community, offering writing lessons and boarding services. The neighborhood kids loved it, the residents appreciated the charm it brought, and Helen. Well, she eventually resigned from the HOA board, defeated and humiliated. Justice had never felt so good. Helen might have resigned, but that didn't mean the HOA was done causing trouble. Even after their humiliating defeat, there were still a few die-hard board members clinging to the idea that they could salvage their reputation. They were desperate to reassert control, and their new target, the stable, had built right in the heart of their neighborhood. It started with complaints, petty, ridiculous grievances that they filed with the city on an almost daily basis. They claimed the smell of hay was unbearable, that the sound of hooves was disruptive, that the presence of horses was a safety hazard. Each complaint was more absurd than the last, and each one was dismissed just as quickly. I had followed every zoning law, every permit requirement, and had built everything by the book. Then, they tried to sabotage me in more underhanded ways. Someone started calling in fake noise complaints, reporting that the stable was hosting unauthorized events late into the night. Of course, every time the authorities showed up, they found nothing but a quiet barn and a few horses peacefully resting in their stalls. It didn't take long for me to figure out who was behind it. The new HOA president, a man named Richard Thornton, was just as bad as Helen had been, only less strategic and far more desperate. He had been one of Helen's biggest supporters, a man who believed that HOA rules should be absolute, even when they had no legal standing. Richard didn't have Helen's ability to manipulate city officials, but he did have a mean streak. When the complaints didn't work, he escalated his tactics. One morning, I found the entrance to my stable blocked with a pile of broken tree limbs and trash. Someone had deliberately dumped it there in an attempt to make it look like storm debris. I installed additional security cameras that same day. A week later, one of my water lines had been mysteriously cut, flooding part of the pasture. That was when decided it was time to stop playing defense. If the HOA wanted a war, they were about to get one. I started by addressing the residents directly. Most of them didn't care about the HOA's petty vendetta. In fact, a good number of them enjoyed the stable. I had families regularly bringing their kids to see the horses, and a few had even started taking riding lessons. So, I organized a community meeting, inviting everyone to come down to the stable for an open discussion. Richard and his remaining allies on the board didn't bother to show up, which was a mistake. Instead of letting them control the narrative, I laid everything out for the residents: the harassment, the false complaints, the sabotage. Even played footage from my security cameras showing the latest acts of vandalism. The response was exactly what I had hoped for. People were furious. They had tolerated the HOA's nonsense for years, but this was too far. More than half the neighborhood signed a petition calling for the immediate removal of the remaining board members. With that petition in hand, I made my next move. I filed for an official homeowner vote to dissolve the HOA entirely. It was an extreme measure, but the residents were fed up, and I had gathered enough signatures to force the vote. Richard panicked. He tried to call an emergency HOA meeting to rally support, but barely anyone showed up. His only remaining allies were a handful of the most overbearing rule enforcers in the neighborhood, the type who loved to measure grass height and fine people for leaving trash cans out a minute too long. But they were outnumbered, and they knew it. When the vote finally happened, it wasn't even close. Nearly 70% of the homeowners voted to dissolve the HOA completely. And just like that, the tyrants lost their last shred of power. With the HOA officially gone, Richard and his supporters had no authority left. The absurd fines, the harassment, the sabotage, it all ended overnight. The neighborhood finally got to breathe, free from the nonsense that had plagued it for years. As for me, well, I expanded the stable. With the HOA gone, I was able to buy another small plot of land and turn it into a riding trail that looped through the community. The best part, the former HOA board members had to watch as their precious, meticulously controlled neighborhood transformed into something real, something vibrant, something they could no longer control. And Helen, she moved away not long after the HOA collapsed. Without her title, she had no power, no influence. She had built her entire identity around controlling others, and when that was taken away, she had nothing left. I never heard from her again. But every time I walked past the stable, I couldn't help but appreciate the irony. The very thing she had tried to destroy had become the heart of the neighborhood, the thing that brought people together, that made the community stronger. Justice had never looked so good. With the HOA gone, the neighborhood transformed almost overnight. The atmosphere grew lighter, as if an invisible weight had been lifted. People who had once kept to themselves out of fear of incurring the wrath of Helen, Richard, and their enforcers began stepping outside more often. Neighbors started chatting in their yards, kids played freely without worrying about arbitrary noise complaints, and homeowners took pride in their properties without the threat of ridiculous fines. The stable had become a hub of activity. Families brought their children to learn about the horses, and a few residents even volunteered to help with daily chores. Without the HOA's interference, I expanded operations, adding a small riding trail that wound through the outskirts of the neighborhood. The community embraced it wholeheartedly, enjoying the rustic charm it brought. But despite the neighborhood's newfound peace, there was still unfinished business. The legal battle with the former HOA wasn't entirely over. While the homeowners had successfully voted to dissolve it, the financial wreckage left behind wouldn't just disappear. Helen and Richard had drained the HOA's funds trying to fight me, and now that the organization was defunct, the remaining debts fell squarely on their shoulders. Greg, my lawyer, kept me updated on the fallout. Helen had been forced to sell her house at a loss to cover her legal fees, and Richard wasn't far behind. He had sunk his own money into trying to keep the HOA afloat, and with no more dues coming in, he was left scrambling. The lawsuits against them personally stemming from the destruction of my barn and the fraudulent annexation attempt were still making their way through the courts, and it was only a matter of time before the final ruling. One afternoon, as I was tending to the horses, Greg called with an update. The judge had reached a decision. Helen and Richard were found personally liable for damages, meaning they would have to pay out of their own pockets. They had tried to argue that they were acting on behalf of the HOA, but since the organization no longer existed, that defense fell apart. Greg assured me that collecting the money would be a process, but it was a win nonetheless. Helen had already skipped town, but Richard was still in the neighborhood, and he wasn't handling the loss well. Not long after the ruling, I noticed Richard lurking near the stable. He wasn't causing trouble, not directly, anyway, but he would stand on the sidewalk, watching. His usual arrogance had been replaced with something else, something bitter. I ignored him at first, but when he started showing up daily, I decided it was time to confront him. I approached him calmly, wiping the dust from my hands as I stepped up to the fence. He didn't move, just stared at the stable like it was some kind of personal insult. It was clear he had lost everything: the status, the power, the influence he had wielded over the neighborhood. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked the authority it once held. He asked why I had gone so far, why I hadn't just moved away when the HOA came after me. I told him the truth. This wasn't just about a barn or property lines or HOA rules. It was about standing up to people who thought they could control others through intimidation and deceit. It was about showing the neighborhood that they didn't have to live in fear of a handful of power-hungry individuals. Richard didn't argue. He just nodded, defeated, and walked away. A few weeks later, his house went up for sale. With Helen and Richard gone, the last remnants of their rule faded. The neighborhood had changed for the better, and no one was eager to go back to the way things were. The former HOA lot, now my stable, stood as a permanent reminder of their downfall, a testament to what happened when corruption met resistance. And as the sun set over the rolling fields, I knew that justice hadn't just been served, it had been built, brick by brick, into something lasting. With Helen and Richard gone, the remnants of the old HOA dissolved into nothing more than a bitter memory. The neighborhood, now free from their rigid authority, flourished in ways hadn't expected. Homeowners who had once been terrified of fines and citations began embracing their properties with newfound enthusiasm. Yards that had been kept in pristine but soulless condition under HOA scrutiny now blossomed with personality: colorful gardens, custom fences, and even a few backyard chicks. The stable had become the heart of it all. On weekends, families gathered to watch the horses, and a few residents had even started leasing stalls for their own animals. What had once been a battleground of control had now turned into a place of connection. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very thing Helen and Richard had fought so hard to eliminate had become the defining feature of the neighborhood. But despite the victory, I wasn't done. There was still one final loose end that needed tying up. The financial fallout from the HOA's collapse had left a mess behind, and while Helen had fled before she could deal with the consequences, Richard's situation was still playing out. Greg had been keeping me updated on the legal proceedings. Richard had attempted to delay the payments he owed from the lawsuit, claiming financial hardship, but the judge wasn't buying it. The court had already ruled in my favor, and now it was just a matter of enforcing the judgment. If he didn't pay up, his assets, what little he had left, would be seized. A few weeks after the ruling, I got word from Greg that Richard was officially bankrupt. His house had been foreclosed on, and his personal accounts were drained. He had fought tooth and nail to hold onto some semblance of control, but in the end, the weight of his own decisions had crushed him. I didn't revel in his downfall, but I wasn't about to pretend I felt bad for him either. He had been complicit in everything from the fraudulent annexation to the destruction of my barn, and he had done it all with the belief that he was untouchable. Now, he was the one forced to pack up and leave. With Richard gone, the final remnants of the HOA's old guard vanished. The few remaining supporters, realizing they had no power left, either moved away or quietly assimilated into the community. No one was eager to revive the oppressive rule they had once enforced. As the months passed, the neighborhood continued to evolve. Without HOA restrictions, residents started hosting community events, barbecues, game nights, and even an annual fall festival that was held right next to the stable. What had once been a place of division had become a true neighborhood, not just a collection of houses controlled by a power-hungry board. One afternoon, as I was tending to the horses, Greg stopped by with some unexpected news. The lot where my stable now stood had originally been designated as HOA-owned land, and with the organization officially dissolved, there was a legal technicality in play. Since I had purchased it through a third party, the ownership transfer had been solid, but there was a clause in the original HOA charter that dictated what would happen if the organization ceased to exist. According to the legal documents, any remaining HOA property would be sold, and the profits distributed among the homeowners. But since the HOA had gone under in financial ruin, there was no board left to handle the process. That meant that my purchase of the lot had technically made me the last legal entity tied to the former HOA's assets. In other words, I now had a unique opportunity. Greg laid out the details. Since I was the last recorded owner of the HOA's primary asset, I had the right to take control of what little remained of the organization before officially dissolving it completely. It was a legal loophole, one that allowed me to ensure that no future HOA could ever be reestablished in the neighborhood. I didn't hesitate. With Greg's help, I filed the necessary paperwork, ensuring that the HOA was not just dissolved, but legally barred from reforming under the same structure. Any attempt to establish a new HOA would require an entirely new charter, unanimous homeowner consent, and a full city council review, a nearly impossible set of hurdles. The neighborhood was free, permanently. The final nail in the coffin came when I received a letter in the mail a few weeks later. It was from a law firm representing Helen. Apparently, after fleeing town, she had attempted to appeal the lawsuit, hoping to overturn the damages she owed. But with no HOA left to back her up, and the fraud charges still lingering over her head, her appeal had been dismissed outright. She had lost completely. I didn't bother responding. There was nothing left to say. Standing at the edge of the stable, watching the sun set over the community I had fought so hard to protect, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not just because I had won, but because the neighborhood had won. Helen and Richard had tried to control everything, to bend the community to their will. But in the end, all they had done was unite the residents against them. And now, the only thing left of their reign was the stable, a monument to their failure, and a symbol of what happens when people stand up against those who abuse power. The battle was over, and justice had prevailed. With the HOA permanently dismantled and its remnants scattered, life in the neighborhood settled into a peaceful rhythm. The days of constant surveillance, petty fines, and power-hungry rule enforcers were over. Homeowners embraced their newfound freedom, and the community, once strangled by rigid control, blossomed into something organic and welcoming. The stable became more than just a business, it became the heart of the neighborhood. Residents who had once been wary of speaking out against the HOA now gathered for weekend events, writing lessons, and even small community fairs. The transformation was undeniable. What had started as my personal stand against tyranny had evolved into something far greater, a symbol of resilience and unity. One evening, as I was closing up the stable, Greg stopped by with an update. He had a file tucked under his arm, and his face carried a look of satisfaction. He handed me the folder, and as I flipped through its contents, a wave of finality washed over me. It was the last of the legal paperwork confirming that every loose end regarding the HOA's dissolution had been tied up. The debts had been settled, the fraudulent annexation had been thoroughly overturned, and every last trace of Helen and Richard's reign had been erased from the official records. The neighborhood was no longer bound by outdated covenants or power-hungry enforcers. Greg pointed out one particular document, a final ruling from the city, ensuring that no future HOA could be reinstated without a near impossible level of approval. The very thing Helen had tried to expand had now been legally barred from ever returning. With the paperwork finalized, Greg and I headed toward the main barn, where a group of neighbors had begun gathering for a small celebration. Someone had set up a fire pit, and a few residents were bringing out food and drinks. It was a far cry from the rigid, soulless events the HOA had once forced onto the community. This was something real, something built by the people who actually lived here. As I stood by the fire, watching the neighborhood come together in a way that had never been possible under HOA rule, a familiar face appeared at the edge of the crowd. Richard. His presence sent a ripple of murmurs through the gathering, but no one confronted him. He wasn't here to cause trouble, he was simply observing. His house had been sold, and from what I had heard, he was staying in a temporary rental outside of town. He had lost everything he had fought so hard to control, and now he was nothing more than a spectator in the very community he had once ruled with an iron grip. He met my gaze, but there was no hostility left in his expression, just resignation. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. That was the last time I ever saw him. As the fire crackled and the sounds of laughter filled the air, I realized something important. This wasn't just about winning a fight against an abusive system. It was about rebuilding something better in its place. The HOA had thrived on fear and compliance, but now the neighborhood was thriving on trust and cooperation. The battle was over, and this time, nothing was left standing in the way of the community we had built.